The storm had been building over the Cascade Range for 3 days before anyone thought to evacuate the remote medical clinic. By the time the warning came through on February 14th, the mountain roads were already impassable. Rebecca Halloway, a trauma nurse from Seattle working a temporary rotation at the Alpine Ridge Medical Station, made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She stayed behind to monitor 2 patients too critical to move. The clinic sat at 7,200 feet, carved into the mountainside like a concrete bunker, built in the 1970s to serve logging camps and ski resorts that had long since closed. Now it served scattered homesteads, backcountry guides, and the occasional lost hiker. The building's brutalist architecture had always seemed excessive to Rebecca, with its reinforced walls and emergency generators. She understood why when she heard the sound. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder trapped inside the mountain itself. Rebecca was checking vitals on Mr. Delaney, a 73-year-old rancher recovering from pneumonia, when the windows began to vibrate. She'd worked in emergency rooms for 12 years, had held together teenagers with gunshot wounds, and pulled children from car wrecks. But nothing had prepared her for the violence of what came next. Before we continue with Rebecca's incredible story of survival, I'd love to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's get back to that mountain. The avalanche hit like a freight train, colliding with the hand of God. The sound was so enormous it stopped being sound at all. It became pressure, a physical force that knocked Rebecca to the floor. Glass exploded inward, metal screamed. The entire building shifted 6 feet down the slope, then stopped with a jolt that threw equipment across rooms and shattered medicine cabinets. Then came the darkness, absolute and suffocating, followed by the settling silence of a tomb. Rebecca's ears rang so badly she couldn't hear her own breathing. She fumbled for her phone, the screen cracked but still glowing, and swept the light across the room. Mr. Delaney was conscious, his oxygen line miraculously still connected. The other patient, Jessica Pham, a 19-year-old snowboarder with a compound fracture, was calling out from the adjacent room in a voice tight with pain and terror. The front third of the clinic had been completely buried. Rebecca tried the main door. It wouldn't budge even an inch. The emergency exit was behind a wall of compacted snow, visible through the broken window. She moved through the wreckage with the phone light, taking inventory with the methodical calm that came from years of triage training. The generator was dead. The radio was buried somewhere in the front offices. The landline was silent. Cell service had always been spotty at this elevation. Now her phone showed nothing but no signal and a battery at 63%. She had 2 patients, limited medical supplies scattered across the floor, no heat, and no way to call for help. The mountain had swallowed them whole. The first night was the coldest. Rebecca gathered every blanket she could find, sealed off the damaged sections with plastic sheeting and medical tape, and moved both patients into the smallest exam room. She positioned them close together and wrapped them like mummies, explaining in a steady voice that they needed to conserve body heat. Mr. Delaney's breathing was labored but stable. Jessica's leg was a more serious concern. The external fixator had shifted in the impact, and Rebecca had to reset it by flashlight while Jessica bit down on a rolled towel. "How long until they find us?" Jessica asked when the worst of the pain had passed. Rebecca wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but she'd always believed patients deserved truth. "The storm is supposed to last another 2 days. They won't be able to search until it clears. Maybe 3 days, maybe 4. And then? Then they'll see the clinic is buried and send rescue teams." Rebecca didn't add what she was thinking, that in Avalanche country buried meant dead, that rescue teams might take weeks to reach this altitude in winter conditions, that by the time they arrived, they'd be looking for bodies, not survivors. She rationed the phone battery like liquid gold, 5 minutes of light every hour, and only when absolutely necessary. The darkness between those 5-minute intervals was so complete, it felt like drowning in ink. She could hear everything: the building settling, snow compressing against the walls, Mr. Delaney's wet breathing, Jessica crying quietly, and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. On the second day, Rebecca found the emergency supply cabinet in what remained of the storage room. Inside were protein bars, bottled water, a first aid kit, and an emergency radio that had been crushed beneath a fallen shelving unit. She counted the bottles: 23. The protein bars, 36. If she rationed carefully, 1 bottle per person per day, half a bar twice daily, they had maybe 8 days of water. The food would last longer, but without water, the food was meaningless. She'd worked in disaster medicine long enough to know the rule of threes: 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. They had plenty of air seeping through cracks in the damaged structure, but water was already their death sentence timer. On the 3rd day, she heard dripping. At first she thought she was hallucinating, her mind conjuring the sound she most desperately needed to hear. But when she followed it with her phone light, she found a crack in the ceiling where meltwater was seeping through, probably from the clinic's damaged heating system bleeding into the snow. The water collected in a small depression in the floor, mixing with dust and debris. Rebecca stared at that dirty puddle for a long moment, then looked at the medical supplies scattered around her. She thought about everything she knew about water purification, about field medicine, about survival. Then she grabbed a stack of sterile gauze bandages and began to work. She layered the bandages in a plastic specimen container, creating a makeshift filter. She poured the dirty water through slowly, watching it emerge slightly clearer on the other side. It wouldn't remove everything. She knew that, but it would remove the largest particulates. She repeated the process 3 times, using fresh bandages each time, until the water in the collection bottle looked almost clear. Then she boiled it over a camping stove she'd found in the staff break room, using the last propane canister. The water tasted like chemicals and regret, but it was water. She allowed each of them 3 small sips. It wasn't enough, but it was something. It was hope measured in ounces. Mr. Delaney's condition worsened on day 5. His pneumonia was progressing without proper antibiotics. The ones she needed were in the pharmacy section, buried under tons of snow and concrete. She had amoxicillin, but his infection needed something stronger. His breathing became increasingly labored, each breath a wet rattle that echoed in the darkness. Rebecca sat beside him during the long hours, holding his weathered hand, monitoring his pulse, whispering stories about her daughter Emily back in Seattle, about the mountains in summer when they were covered in wildflowers instead of trying to kill you. "My wife's name was Dorothy," he whispered one night, his voice barely audible. 47 years we had. She died in 2019. Sometimes I think, maybe this is how I'm supposed to go, with her. "You're not going anywhere except home," Rebecca told him firmly. "Your ranch needs you. Those cattle aren't going to feed themselves." He smiled weakly. "Sold the cattle 3 years ago. Just me and that empty house now. Then you're going home to that empty house, and you're going to fill it with something worth living for. That's an order, Mr. Delaney. I'm your nurse, and you have to do what I say." He squeezed her hand. In the darkness, it felt like a promise. Jessica's leg was infected by day 7. Rebecca had known it was coming. There was no way to keep the wound properly clean in these conditions. She administered the antibiotics she had, cleaned the site as best she could with their precious filtered water, and prayed. Jessica had stopped asking when rescue would come. They'd all stopped asking. They existed now in a timeless space, measured only by the slow drip of meltwater and the decreasing number of protein bars. The hallucinations started on day 9. Rebecca would see her daughter standing in the corner, or smell coffee brewing, or hear helicopters that weren't there. She knew it was dehydration, stress, and oxygen deprivation. The building's ventilation system was compromised, and they were slowly suffocating in their own carbon dioxide. She made them talk to each other, tell stories, stay conscious. Sleep was dangerous. Sleep was too close to giving up. On day 12, the dripping stopped. The meltwater had frozen again, or the source had dried up. Rebecca stared at their last 3 bottles of water with the kind of calculation that would have horrified her 2 weeks ago. 1 bottle each. Maybe 2 days left. Then decisions she didn't want to make. That night, she dreamed of Seattle rain, of standing in the parking lot of Swedish Medical Center and letting the water pour over her face. She woke up crying, her tears immediately freezing on her cheeks. The temperature had dropped further. Mr. Delaney's breathing had become alarmingly shallow. The breakthrough came on day 15, not from above, but from below. Rebecca was changing Mr. Delaney's position to prevent bed sores when she heard it. A different kind of sound. Not settling or compression, but movement, deliberate movement. She pressed her ear to the floor and heard it again. A metallic scraping, distant but real. "Someone's there," she whispered, afraid to hope. "Someone's digging." She pounded on the floor with a metal tray, creating a rhythm. 3 slow beats, 3 fast, 3 slow. SOS. She repeated it until her arms ached, then waited. Silence. Then, faintly, impossibly, the rhythm came back. 3 slow, 3 fast, 3 slow. Tears streamed down Rebecca's face. "They're coming," she told her patients. "They're really coming." But the digging was slow, agonizingly slow. Rebecca realized they must be tunneling horizontally, trying to reach the lower level of the clinic from some kind of access point. It could take days. And they didn't have days. They had hours of water left, and Mr. Delaney's pulse was becoming thready and irregular. She made the decision on day 17. She gave her last bottle of water to her patients, keeping nothing for herself. Jessica protested weakly, but Rebecca insisted. "I'm younger, I'm stronger, and I'm not injured. You need it more." What she didn't say was that if rescue didn't come in the next 24 hours, the water wouldn't matter anyway. By day 19, Rebecca could barely move. Her tongue was swollen, her lips cracked and bleeding, her thoughts fragmented and strange. She lay on the floor near the sound of digging, which had grown louder, closer. She could hear voices now, muffled but human. Real human voices from the real world, not the phantom conversations that had been haunting her dreams. "We're here," she tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. She grabbed the metal tray again and pounded weakly. 3 slow, 3 fast, 3 slow, please, please, please. The wall exploded inward on the afternoon of day 23. Not the wall she'd been watching, but a section of floor in the adjacent room. Light, real, genuine, painful light, flooded in along with freezing air and the most beautiful sound Rebecca had ever heard. Human voices shouting, "We've got them! We've got survivors!" The rescue team leader was a woman named Captain Andrea Cole from Mount Baker Search and Rescue. She crawled through the opening with a headlamp and emergency medical kit, took one look at Rebecca and immediately called for IV fluids and emergency transport. More rescuers flooded in, 6, 8, 10 of them, moving with practiced efficiency, assessing the patients, setting up equipment, radiating competence and hope. 23 days, Captain Cole said, her voice filled with something like awe. Everyone thought, "We're alive," Rebecca whispered through cracked lips. "All 3 of us, we're alive." Mr. Delaney was extracted first, loaded onto a rescue basket, and passed through the tunnel they'd carved through 50 feet of compacted snow and debris. Jessica went next, crying with relief and pain as they stabilized her leg for transport. Rebecca refused to go until she saw them both safely away, standing on legs that barely held her weight, watching as they disappeared into the tunnel toward light and life and the world she'd thought she'd never see again. As they loaded her onto the final basket, Rebecca looked back at the destroyed exam room that had been their prison and salvation. In the harsh LED lights of the rescue team, she could see the makeshift water filtration system she'd built from medical supplies, the carefully rationed protein bar wrappers arranged in daily piles, the marks on the wall where she'd counted days like a castaway counting time. Captain Cole noticed her looking. "The water filtration system," she said quietly. "That's what saved you. When we finally got cell records and started piecing together what might have happened, our survival expert said no way anyone could last more than 7 days without water at this elevation. But you did it. You actually did it." "I'm a nurse," Rebecca said simply. "I solve problems. That's what we do." The helicopter ride down the mountain was surreal. Rebecca pressed her face against the window, watching the white expanse of snow that had nearly killed them recede below. They flew over the search base camp, where she could see dozens of vehicles, rescue teams, journalists, and crowds of people. Captain Cole later told her that their rescue had become national news, that she'd been presumed dead, along with her patients, that memorial services had been planned, that her daughter Emily had been interviewed on television, begging them not to give up the search. They landed at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, where Rebecca had worked for 5 years before taking the mountain rotation. Her colleagues were waiting, and when they wheeled her through the emergency department doors, there was applause. Actual applause. She was too exhausted and overwhelmed to process it fully, but she saw Emily, her beautiful, stubborn 22-year-old daughter, pushing through the crowd, sobbing and laughing at the same time. "Mom!" Emily choked out, gripping Rebecca's hand as they moved toward a trauma bay. "Mum, they said you were dead. They said there was no way." "I know, baby," Rebecca whispered, "but I had to come home. Someone needs to teach you how to filter water with gauze bandages. You never know when you might need that skill." Emily laughed through her tears. Even the paramedics smiled. Rebecca spent 8 days in the hospital, recovering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, frostbite on her fingers and toes, and what the doctors called stress-induced physiological trauma. Mr. Delaney was 3 rooms down, his pneumonia finally responding to proper antibiotics. Jessica was in orthopedic surgery, where specialists were repairing the damage to her leg and treating the infection that had nearly turned septic. On the 4th day of her hospital stay, Captain Cole visited. She brought coffee, real coffee, not the hospital cafeteria version, and sat in the chair beside Rebecca's bed with the air of someone carrying important news. "We finished excavating the clinic," Cole said. "You should know. The Avalanche was bigger than we initially thought. The entire front section of the building, the offices, the pharmacy, the main entrance, was completely obliterated. If you'd been anywhere but that back exam room cluster, you wouldn't have survived the initial impact." Rebecca nodded slowly. She'd suspected as much. "The radio equipment was destroyed on impact," Cole continued. "The emergency beacon was buried under 40 feet of snow. Every single survival protocol we have says there's no way you should have made it past day 7, maybe 10, if you were exceptionally lucky, but 23 days. She shook her head. "The water filtration system you built, the rationing protocol you implemented, the way you managed your patients' medical needs with limited supplies, it's going to be studied in search and rescue programs. You created a textbook case study in survival medicine." "I just did what needed to be done," Rebecca said quietly. "I couldn't let them die. I couldn't let myself die. My daughter needs me. Those patients needed me. So I figured it out." Cole leaned forward, her expression serious. "Can I ask you something? On day 19, when you gave your last water to your patients, did you think you were going to die?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, remembering the feel of that cold floor against her cheek, the sound of digging that seemed both impossibly close and impossibly far away. "Yes," she admitted finally. "I thought that was it. But I also thought, if I'm going to die, at least let me die knowing I did everything possible. At least let me die trying." "You're remarkable, Rebecca. I've been doing this for 18 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did." After Cole left, Rebecca sat alone with her coffee, watching Seattle rain streak down the hospital window. She thought about Mr. Delaney's empty house and his dead wife, Dorothy. She thought about Jessica's youth and all the mountains she'd climb again. She thought about her own daughter and the life waiting for her beyond this hospital room. She'd spent 23 days in the dark, filtering dirty water through gauze bandages, counting protein bars, and fighting for every single breath. She'd been buried alive under a mountain and had refused to die. Not because she was heroic or superhuman, but because she was a nurse, because she'd taken an oath to heal, to protect, to preserve life, including her own. The story could have ended there, with recovery and reunion and the slow return to normal life, but there was one more chapter to write. 3 months later, on a clear May morning, Rebecca drove back up the mountain. Not to the clinic. That was gone, destroyed by the Avalanche and then demolished by the county, but to a meadow nearby where wildflowers were beginning to bloom through the last patches of melting snow. Mr. Delaney sat beside her in the passenger seat, moving slowly but steadily, his pneumonia long since conquered. Jessica was in the back, her leg in a walking boot but healing well. They'd come for the memorial service the county had organized for the rescue teams, but they'd also come for something else. Captain Cole was there, along with 40 other rescue workers who'd spent weeks digging through snow to find 3 people everyone else had given up for dead. There were speeches about courage and determination and the power of hope. Rebecca stood and spoke briefly about the sound of digging she'd heard on day 15, about how that sound had meant everything. But afterward, when the crowd had dispersed and the official ceremony was over, Rebecca and her 2 former patients stood together at the edge of the meadow, looking down at the valley below. "I think about it every day," Jessica said quietly. "Being trapped in that darkness, thinking I'd never see my family again, and then hearing you tell me I had to keep fighting, that you needed me to stay strong." "I was so ready to give up," Mr. Delaney admitted. "That house was empty, my wife was gone, and I thought maybe being buried in that mountain was just easier. But you wouldn't let me quit. You kept talking to me, kept making me promise I'd go home." "I sold the ranch," he continued. "Bought a place in town near the senior center, started volunteering at the library. Dorothy always said I read too much. Now I'm helping kids learn to read too much." He smiled. "Turns out an empty house doesn't have to stay empty. You just have to fill it with something worth living for. I think you said something like that." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes. "I remember. I'm going back to school," Jessica said. "Pre-med. I figure if I'm going to spend the rest of my life terrified of avalanches, I might as well do something useful with the fear. Maybe become a trauma surgeon, like the one who fixed my leg. Or a wilderness medicine doctor. Someone who can help people the way you helped us." They stood in silence for a moment, 3 people bound together by darkness and water filtered through gauze and the stubborn refusal to surrender. "I keep thinking about those 23 days, Rebecca said finally. "How everything came down to the smallest decisions. How many ounces of water to ration, whether to use the phone light for 30 seconds or save the battery, which antibiotics to use when. Each choice felt impossible, but we made them anyway. We survived them." "You survived them," Jessica corrected. "We just held on while you figured everything out." Rebecca shook her head. "No, we survived together. I couldn't have done it without you both staying strong, staying conscious, staying alive. Survival isn't something you do alone. It's something we do for each other." Mr. Delaney put his weathered hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "My Dorothy used to say that the measure of a person isn't how they handle the good times. It's what they do when everything goes to hell and there's no good choice left. You measured up, Rebecca. You measured up for all of us." They walked back to the parking area together, 3 survivors moving slowly but steadily through the wildflowers. Rebecca thought about Emily waiting for her back in Seattle, about the nursing shifts she'd return to next month, about the ordinary miracle of having a tomorrow to plan for. The mountain still stood above them, massive and indifferent, covered in snow that would melt and freeze an avalanche again, but they had beaten it. With gauze, bandages and protein bars and stubborn hope, they had looked at impossible odds and said, "Not today." As they reached the parking lot, Captain Cole approached one more time. "Rebecca, before you go, I wanted you to know that the county is installing a new emergency rescue system for remote medical facilities, better communication equipment, reinforced structures, improved early warning systems. They're calling it the Halloway Protocol." Rebecca blinked in surprise. "That's not necessary." "It is necessary," Cole insisted. "Because what you did in that clinic, with basically nothing but determination and medical training, it changed how we think about survival protocols. You proved that with knowledge and creativity and absolute refusal to quit, people can survive things we thought were impossible. That needs to be remembered. It needs to be taught." 3 months after that, Rebecca gave a lecture at the University of Washington Medical School. The auditorium was packed with students, professors, and emergency medicine professionals. She stood at the podium with PowerPoint slides showing the destroyed clinic, the makeshift water filtration system, the rationing charts she'd kept. But she didn't talk about heroism or miracles. She talked about problem-solving under pressure, about breaking impossible situations into manageable pieces, about the science of water purification and the psychology of maintaining hope in darkness. She talked about how survival often comes down to the smallest, most ordinary acts of care, holding a patient's hand, telling stories in the dark, making someone promise to see tomorrow. "I'm not special," she told the room full of future doctors and nurses. "I just refused to accept that death was inevitable. I looked at the resources I had, gauze, plastic containers, a camping stove, 2 patients who needed me to stay strong, and I built survival from those pieces. That's what medicine is. That's what we do. We take broken things and we figure out how to make them work." A student raised her hand. "What was the hardest moment? The point where you almost gave up?" Rebecca thought about day 19, about lying on that cold floor with her last water given away, hearing digging that might have been real or might have been hallucination. But she also thought about Mr. Delaney's hand squeezing hers in the dark, and Jessica's voice asking if they'd be okay, and the weight of knowing that if she quit, they'd quit too. "The hardest moment was every moment," Rebecca answered honestly. "Every single decision, every hour in the dark, every time I had to choose between bad options and worse ones. But the reason I didn't give up was simple. I wasn't alone. I had people depending on me, and I had people I was depending on. None of us could afford to quit because we were keeping each other alive." She paused, looking out at the young faces watching her so intently. "That's the real lesson from those 23 days. Survival isn't about being strong enough to save yourself. It's about being connected enough to save each other." The lecture ended with standing applause, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was thinking about wildflowers on a mountain meadow, about coffee in a hospital room, about her daughter's hand in hers. She was thinking about how she'd gone into that mountain as a nurse and come out as something more, a testimony to what humans could endure, what they could overcome, what they could build from nothing but determination and gauze bandages and the stubborn belief that tomorrow was worth fighting for. That night, Rebecca drove back to her apartment in Seattle. She made tea and sat by the window, watching rain fall on the city below. Her phone buzzed with messages, from Jessica sending updates about medical school applications, from Mr. Delaney sharing pictures of the book club he'd joined, from Captain Cole asking if she'd be willing to consult on a new wilderness medicine training program. She answered them all, these people who'd been woven into her life by catastrophe and survival. Then she opened a new message to Emily. "Dinner this weekend? I'll cook. I promise not to serve protein bars." Emily's response came immediately. "Only if you tell me more mountain stories, the ones you haven't talked about yet." Rebecca smiled. There were stories she hadn't told, moments too dark and desperate to share easily. But maybe someday she would. Maybe someday she'd find the words to describe what it felt like to filter water through gauze in absolute darkness, to count heartbeats when you couldn't count hours, to look at death and say, "Not yet, not today, not while I still have fight left." For now, though, it was enough to be home, to drink clean water from a tap, to feel warm air from a heater, to know that when morning came, she'd see the sun. These ordinary miracles that most people took for granted, Rebecca would never take them for granted again. She'd spent 23 days buried under a mountain, and she'd emerged with a truth carved into her bones, that human beings were capable of extraordinary things, not because they were superhuman, but because they were human. Because they could take gauze bandages and make water purifiers, because they could count protein bars and make hope. Because they could sit in darkness and still believe in light. The mountain had tried to kill her, but she'd filtered dirty water, rationed protein bars, held dying hands, and refused to surrender. And in the end, against impossible odds, with nothing but determination and gauze bandages, and stubborn love for the world, she refused to leave behind. She'd won.